When you are a beginner photographer, it's difficult to understand what other photographers are doing to create such great photos. And even if you are an advanced photographer, there is always something new to learn from other photographers. I think this series, where we all learn from other artists, should also include younger photographers that have high quality photos. Today I'll analyze the composition and editing techniques of the landscape photographer Max Rive, so we can all learn new tips, new ways of looking at landscape photography and new ways to approach it. Let's start with this photo, which is a wide angle one, and as you can see over here we have a beautiful foreground element which probably was post-processed, and it was given more light in the post-processing moment. And as you can see, we have a really strong diagonal over here, but then again we have another strong diagonal from this place. Now there's a rule in painting that says whenever you see the intersection of two important lines in your photo or painting, on that vertical you should place your main interest, your main subject, and this is the case with this image. And you also see in terms of editing a slight desaturation of the elements that don't contribute directly to the image. For example, the sky, this part of the mountain, so you have saturation of the foreground element, and then some in this place, and most importantly on the subject. Moving on to this other photo, which uses the same technique with a really wide angle and framing this big foreground, and it's a variation of the first photo, and the reason for which I included it to emphasize more this idea that you need to keep you don't necessarily need to keep saturation only on the elements that matter, but it helps you convey a certain idea. This is a simple way to direct the eye towards the element or elements that are most important in the photo. Creating big and impressive panoramas can really help you get a real sense of how big the landscape is. Of course that it helps with this human figure over here. It helps to give proportion and dimension to the place. It helps that the light falls conveniently exactly over here. But it also helps to analyze the photo in terms of how the lines converge, and as you can see, this line goes down and this one comes down, and basically it's a way of directing the eye towards here. And another thing that you can notice in terms of editing is that the shadows and darker parts are slightly shifted to blue, and even these patches of snow are shifted to blue. But when it comes to patches of light and places where the light goes, you can see warm tones, and there's a simple rule that says that the eye will be drawn by warmer tones, so keep in mind when you edit your photos. The human figure can add proportion and dimension, and it can also add balance in this photo. This is a very beautifully executed image, and if we take a look at this stream of water, it directs the eye towards the background, but we have this diagonal and these diagonals over here. All these elements are meant to keep your eye in this area. The problem without this human figure is that the photo kind of tilts this way, so this photo adds equilibrium to this side of the image. Now a thing that Max Rive does very often is to use frames inside the frame, and the more creative you get with this kind of technique, the more interesting your results are going to be. For example, this is a very creative way to use frames inside the frame. Again, the same technique, keeping colder tones over here and then warmer tones over here. It's a difficult image to execute. It's difficult to do in one shot only if you have a camera that has a really big dynamic range. If you don't have such a camera, then you will have to do an exposure for this area, and then probably one or two or maybe three exposures for this framing, depending on the quality of your sensor. Now let's take a look at this photo. This is Trecime di Lavaredo in the Dolomites, and it's often, this is a very useful technique to know to photograph from darkness towards light. It's something that I often do in my forest photography, and in this case, as you can see, the way he edited this photo, he's adding a little bit of colder tones to this darker area, and also as you can see the editing, it looks like a spiral and kind of directs the eye towards this element. So it goes like this, and then you have a little more light over here, and then the brightest part is the subject in the background. Is using multiple layers of the landscape, of the elements, of the vegetation to create a sense of depth. Depth is something that it's really important to achieve in your landscape photos. Over here we have this layer, and then we have multiple layers, and this way you get a sense of dimension in the landscape. So let's recap the composition and editing tips that we can all learn from the photographs of Max Rive. Where two important lines intersect in your photo, on that vertical, place your subject. When you edit your photo, you can slightly desaturate the elements that don't directly contribute to the composition of your photo. Massive panoramas can create powerful representations of the landscape. A human figure in the scene can add perspective and dimension to the entire landscape. When you edit, keep warm tones on the elements you want the eye to stay focused on, and colder tones on the elements that you want the eye to go away from. Be creative with frames inside a frame to create depth in your photos. You can also create depth by including multiple layers of elements. And a bonus tip is always watch for the light and be prepared to photograph what that light is shining on. You can also watch all the other videos in this series, and this way you can learn new tips and ideas about landscape photography. And until next time, keep on photographing. It's the only way that you can get better